I remember the night the city broke its heat record because the studio stopped feeling like a room and started feeling like a mouth that wouldn't exhale. The air conditioner rattled once, then slumped into a low, pointless hum that only pushed hot breath around. Heat layered on my skin. My shirt pasted itself to my back. The glass booth had never felt small before. That night, it was a fishbowl. The hallway beyond the window dissolved into dark and exit signs. The red-on-air light over the pane didn't just glow, it glared. An angry eye that wanted noise. I slid the pot up and dropped into my radio voice smooth, warm, the one the program director liked. It sounded fine in my headphones and wrong in my head. Too polished for air thick enough to chew. It's officially the hottest night this city has ever recorded, I told whoever was still awake out there. Most nights the job was simple. Keep lonely people company until sleep, or the hum of their refrigerator won. I padded out the hours with traffic reports, stale jokes, songs from playlists I hadn't even built. I pretended I was in their kitchens and bedrooms, not sealed in a glass box that smelled like hot plastic and old dust. Out in the green room, behind another pane of glass, my father lay on the station's tired leather couch. Arthur Vance, retired electrician in Hillcrest generation, had insisted on riding out the heat here instead of at his apartment. He said they'd built this place to stay on, then nodded off with a small fan pushing the same hot air across his face. He coughed once, a dry tear of sound that slipped under my headphones. His eyes stayed closed, but his hand went to his chest and rested there for a moment before dropping back. When the last chorus faded, I did the weather line and a joke about people sleeping in bathtubs full of ice. "Tell me where you're riding out the heat," I said, reaching for something that sounded playful. "Call in with your tricks, old school fans, wet towels, midnight showers." On the panel, the caller 3 light blinked to life, steady green in the corner of the board. I tapped the fader with one finger, feeling that tacky slide again. Then I hit the button and opened the line. "Graveyard line, you're on with Eli," I said in the tone I could do half asleep. "Where are you? And how are you staying cool tonight?" The line sounded wrong before she answered, packed with hiss, and a boxed-in echo like someone had set the phone inside a metal drawer. Under the noise, something thumped unevenly. With a thin mechanical whine riding on top, "I'm at Hillcrest Nursing Home," a girl's voice said. Young, and trying not to shake up on the hill. "We lost power." Hillcrest landed in the booth like a dropped wrench, hitting my ribs before it reached my ears. In my head, it was brick and white trim, a lit sign over shrubs, windows glowing over the river like a cruise ship. That picture did not match the sound in my headphones. I glanced through the glass at my father and watched the muscle in his jaw jump. His hand stopped mid-arc in a lazy, dreaming gesture and just hung there, caught by the word. I pulled the music bed all the way down and let the studio go bare. The small desk fan sounded obscene in the sudden quiet. "Are you on backup power?" I asked, my radio voice thinning without my permission. "We were," she said. "The generator kicked in, but it doesn't sound right, and it's really hot in here." The halls, the rooms. The windows are painted shut, so there's no air. The emergency lights are on, but they're dim, like the whole building is tired. Her words painted over my cruise ship picture with hallways full of soup-thick air and rooms sealed with heavy brushstrokes. My phone screen lit with a message from the producer, a small blue rectangle at the edge of my vision. I didn't have to open it to know the script about how we're not an emergency line and should dump calls like this. "Have you called emergency services?" I asked, because some part of the job still remembered its lines. "We called," she said. "They put us on hold and then the line went dead." "How many people are with you?" I asked, fingers resting on the next song button. "I'm just a volunteer. There are 3 of us on the floor, and a lot of the residents are on oxygen. One man in room 12 is already having trouble. His chest keeps catching and the machines beep and then stop. And then beep again." Behind the glass, Arthur shifted toward the ceiling speaker. The couch creaked under him while his face tightened around some old memory. On the console, The next song sat queued up, one tap away from swallowing her in something polished and harmless. The producer's text pulsed at the edge of the screen, waiting for me to be the kind of professional who parks this in the dark. The heat pressed in, heavy and shared. Like the studio and that hallway on the hill were drawing from the same hot lung. "Stay with me," I said at last. My radio voice dropped away and what came out was just my own. "Rough from too much hot air, don't hang up again. If anything changes, you tell me, and I'll keep you on this line as long as you need." There was a soft exhale over the hiss and then a small, "Okay." The clock ticked once above the glass while the red on-air light watched me. Somewhere above the river, a machine I couldn't see chewed through fuel it didn't have to spare while my father's breathing scratched through the wall. I might have been the only person awake with a microphone who knew what was happening inside Hillcrest. And I had just chosen not to look away. Maya stayed on the line. For a moment I did nothing except listen. Her breath sat close to the mic, shallow and quick. Under it, the generator thumped in an uneven rhythm, a metal heart skipping beats inside the walls. I slid a low instrumental track up just enough that the transmitter wouldn't sit on pure silence. The music spread thin under us. More heat than relief. I kept it low so I wouldn't lose her. "How long can that generator run?" I asked. "Did anybody say?" There was a pause. A tiny scrape like the phone brushing her shoulder. "Maintenance said the tank was full last week," she answered. "They told my supervisor we'd be okay for a few hours if this ever happened. 2, 3 if we're lucky. But it's been going a while already. And it sounds tired." The word lodged in my chest. Tired generator. Tired building. Tired lungs. In my head, I tried to turn that into simple numbers. A tank that had already burned through some unknown chunk of fuel. Sealed rooms full of people whose bodies treated air like medicine. Even with bad math, the curve was obviously going the wrong way. "Where are you right now?" I asked. "In the west hallway," she said. "3rd floor. We're moving people closer to the nurses' station. It feels a little less bad there." She must have turned as she talked because the sound shifted. The echo narrowed. I heard rubber soles squeak on linoleum, the soft bump of something hitting a wall. A monitor nearby beeped 3 short notes, then went quiet again, like it was trying not to be rude. "Can you see anyone?" I asked. "I'm looking at them," she said, her voice dropping. "Mistress Kane is by the window that doesn't open." Her hair stuck to her neck. "Mr. Alvarez keeps asking why it's so dark. His oxygen tube keeps slipping when he sweats and we have to keep putting it back. He thinks the sun is supposed to fix this." One by one, her sentences pushed the board out of my mind and replaced it with narrow beds, plastic cups of warm water, thin blankets trapping heat instead of blocking it. Air sat on skin like a wet shirt. In the studio, the transmitter's hum curled around her words, a low animal in the walls. I watched the meters, making sure they never quite kissed 0. As long as something moved, music, breath, her voice, I could pretend this was still just a show. My phone lit again. Another blue rectangle from the producer blinked at the edge of my vision. I didn't open it. I already knew the lines. "Keep it light, don't scare people. Route emergencies to the numbers on the poster by the door." In the green room, Arthur shifted on the couch. I didn't hear his cough this time. I watched his hand slide to his chest, fingers pressing into the thin cotton of his undershirt. His face tipped toward the ceiling speaker, jaw set. Even half asleep, his body flinched at the same words, power, generator, Hillcrest. I brought my hand back to the mic and nudged my own fader up. "If you're out driving near the ridge tonight," I said, "do me a favor. Look up toward Hillcrest. Tell me what you see, lights, sirens, nothing at all. Text the line, call in, let me know. Don't do anything risky, just keep an eye on the hill with me." On paper, I was only asking about the view. To anyone actually listening, it was a hand stretched out into the dark. "I'm going to put you on hold for a second. Okay, Maya, I said. You'll still be here. Don't hang up. I won't, she said. Her voice sounded smaller now, the hallway eating the edges of it. They're starting to get restless. It's hard for them to breathe when they get scared. I pictured a room full of chests rising faster, not just from heat, but from panic, each breath pulling more out of the same shrinking pile. Fear is a second temperature in the building. I punched her line over to the whole bus, careful not to drop it, and eased a softer track under my own voice, late-night wallpaper music, the kind you spin when you don't want to admit something has gone wrong. Still here with you on the hottest night this city's ever logged, I told whoever was awake out there. My radio voice tried to climb back in. I kept it on a short leash. If you're near a window, crack it. If you're on oxygen or looking after somebody who is, make sure the tanks aren't running low. Check on each other. And if you're up by the ridge, give me a call. I'm especially curious how things look up that way. The meters bounced politely. Text blinked in the corner of the screen, jokes about frying eggs on sidewalks, a shot of someone's dog belly up in front of a box fan. One message that just said, "It's dark up there. No lights." Arthur swung his legs off the couch. I watched his bare feet find the carpet, slow and deliberate. He stared through the glass at me, eyes bleary but more focused than they'd been all day. His lips shaped a word I couldn't hear. It looked a lot like Hillcrest. I let the music roll for a few more seconds, then dipped it again until it was barely there. "Maya," I said, bringing her line back to air. "You still with me?" "Yeah," she said. The word came out with a shiver. The generator just coughed. The lights dimmed again. Mr. Alvarez asked if the sun went out. I checked the clock. 12:23. Maybe 2 hours on that tank if the maintenance guy hadn't been bluffing. Maybe less, with all those machines dragging on it. The producer's text sat at the edge of my vision like a hot coin. My father's stare held from the other side of the glass. Technically, I could have thanked her, cleared the line, reminded listeners to dial emergency services, and gone back to being safe background noise. That was the move that wouldn't get anyone a meeting in the morning. Instead, I leaned in toward the mic like I was bending closer to her. Closer to the whole building on the hill. "Okay," I said. "Here's what we're going to do. You stay with me. If anything changes, if those lights flicker, if that generator sounds worse, if anyone's breathing gets any harder, you tell me right away. I'll keep this line open as long as I can." Silence held for 1 beat. Then 2. I heard the generator's tired thump, the faint rattle of a cart, somebody coughing far down the hall. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." The red-on-air eye burned over the glass. The room around me was still a mouth that wouldn't exhale. Somewhere up on the ridge, a tank of fuel kept turning itself into heat and noise and thin, borrowed time. And I understood that the clock for the night had just truly started. The studio phone sounded different when it was the office calling, not the soft chirp of a listener line, but a sharp, close ring that cut straight through the music bed. On the board, the green light for Hillcrest held steady. Next to it, the internal line blinked red. I eased a low instrumental track up, hit the hotline button, and slid one ear of my headphones off. "This is Eli," I said. No one outside would hear this part. A small click, and then the corporate voice arrived. "Eli. Hi." Karen, from programming. Her voice was crystal clear, flattened by some compressor in a cooler room. "Thanks for keeping folks calm tonight." Out of the corner of my eye, the green hold LED from Maya glowed like a trapped firefly. In my head, I still heard her hallway. Generator thumping off tempo, air like soup, a man's breath catching. Karen didn't hear any of that. She said she was calling about Hillcrest, that the station had heard about the outage, that their understanding was the generator was working as designed. Residents were safe. Protocols were in place. She didn't want families panicking because of emergency language on air. "I've got a volunteer on hold who's inside the building," I said. "She says it's brutally hot. Some residents are struggling to breathe." EMS has them on hold. Karen gave a small, polished laugh. Young volunteers could be dramatic, she said. Staff were trained. Checklists existed. Everything was well within contingency. Behind the glass, in the lounge, my father shifted on the couch. The cough was dry and angry. He pushed himself upright, eyes locked on the ceiling speaker. The main thing is tone, Karen said. She needed me to be careful with how I frame this. Words like emergency or dangerous situation could create unnecessary alarm. Families listened. Donors did too. On the board, the red hotline light flashed in a neat rhythm. The green hold light just glowed, steady and small. One line carried a story buffed for a memo. The other carried a girl in a hot hallway, counting breaths. What exactly do you want me to say? I asked. She laid it out in a single sentence. Say there'd been an outage, that backup systems were in place, that there was no indication anyone was in immediate danger. Emphasize the heat, encourage hydration, keep people reassured. Don't single out Hillcrest as a crisis site. Immediate danger. The phrase slid in next to the 2-3 hours if we're lucky math ticking at the back of my skull. If they learned anything different, she promised, they'd let me know. I could hear the paperwork behind it. Meetings, emails, notes quietly added to a file if I picked the wrong version of the night. The transmitter hum edged closer, a low pressure in my ears. In the lounge, Arthur had both feet on the floor, shoulders squared, jaw set in a shape I recognized. I hear you, I said. It was the only honest answer that didn't start a different fire. I'll be careful with my wording, perfect, she said. Then the line clicked, and the red light went dark. The green one stayed. I pulled my headphones fully back on and stared at that tiny green LED. My finger hovered over the button that would bring Maya back. Are you still there? I asked as I brought her up. Yes, she said. The hiss and metal echo wrapped tight around her voice. It's hotter. The hallway feels heavier. Where are you now? I asked. Room 12, she said. Mr. Alvarez. The gray guy. He's not talking anymore. He just looks at me and squeezes my hand when he can. His chest keeps catching. The machine beeps, then skips, then grabs again. We're fanning him with a chart. Behind her, the generator thumped, slower and rougher, like it was dragging each turn through mud. A monitor let out a thin, complaining tone before stumbling back into rhythm. Someone away from the phone said, "Keep him awake," and their voice cracked. How many of you are up there? I asked, eyes flicking from the dead hotline indicator to the green hold light, then to my father through the glass. Same 3, she said. We move the worst ones closer to the nurses' station, but some can't walk. The end of the hall keeps going dark. It feels like the building is holding its breath. Arthur's gaze met mine. Guilt and warning lived there, and something like a tired dare. Don't pretend you didn't hear this. I eased the music bed down until it was only a soft pulse under her breathing. The on-air light glared over the glass. The transmitter hummed. Okay, I said, more to myself than to Maya. We're going to stay with this, the comfortable version of my voice, the one that sold songs and weather stayed gone. What came out when I opened the mic to the city was just me. One man in a hot glass box, choosing whose story got to be real. The wall unit by the door went off, sharp and insistent, cutting straight through the song. It wasn't the soft listener line chime the audience knew. This one sounded close and impatient. I let the track run and crossed the booth. The plastic handset stuck slightly to my fingers when I picked it up. It's me, the producer said. His voice rode intense and tight. Legal is awake and listening. They're throwing the word liability around. If anybody gets hurt driving up there because of what we say, it's on us. The word was already in my head before he said it. Liability. We're a community station, he went on. We can talk heat, grid stress, give people the official numbers to call, remind them to check on each other. That's it. Legal is very clear. This is liability we cannot afford. On the console, Maya's hold light glowed a patient green. Beside it, the red on-air eye over the glass watched from its little box, waiting for me to choose which room I belonged to, the cooled offices with policies. Or the hallway on the hill. What about the volunteer? I asked. She's saying residents are already going down. She's a young volunteer on a scary night, he said. Management is in touch with the facility. EMS is looped in. We cannot have our hosts sending people up there or implying they should intervene. If they go because of something you say, we own that. We own whatever happens when they get there. Do you understand? I understood that if I played it safe, the tape would show I'd followed instructions in a calm, compliant voice. The people who replayed it later in an air-conditioned room would hear a professional doing his job and sleep fine. The people sealed in hot rooms might not. I hear you, I said. I'll be careful. Good, he said. Keep it general. No more specifics. Let the professionals handle it. He hung up. I set the handset back in its cradle and let the song buy us another 30 seconds of pretending the night was normal. On the board, the meters bounced like nothing had changed. In my head, liability buzzed around and around, a word I wasn't supposed to say out loud but couldn't stop hearing. During the next instrumental, I stepped into the hallway. The heat there felt thicker, like it had pooled just outside the booth. In the lounge, Arthur was awake on the couch, glasses low on his nose, a folder open on his knees. He had a legal pad balanced on top. On it, he'd drawn a rough rectangle for the building, smaller blocks for the wings, a crooked line for the service drive curling up from the road north side, he said when he saw me. He tapped a corner of the sketch. They stuck the generator back here by the shrubs, near the service path. They wanted it hidden. Can it breathe back there? I asked. It could, he said, if somebody hadn't planted a hedge around it like a picture frame. Looked nice in the brochure. On a night like this, every cute bush is one more hand over its face. He looked up at me, eyes sharp in the blue wash from the TV. Don't listen to them, he said. Listen to the building. It's telling you it's in trouble. If somebody gets around that hedge and clears the intake, it might buy the place time. I can't promise more than that, but I know it won't hurt. I took a breath, tried to memorize the crooked little map, and carried it back into the booth. The song was sliding toward its last chorus. On the panel, Maya's hold light waited. Another light blinked now, caller 5, a new line from somewhere in the dark. I hit it graveyard line. I said, "You're on with Eli." A man's voice came through, rough around the edges, the kind that lived on truck stop coffee. "I'm in my truck," he said. "Just past the exit for the hill. I heard you talking about Hillcrest. I've got a chainsaw in the bed and a cooler full of ice. I can be there in 5. On the screen, my producer's last message glowed in its little blue bubble. No directions, no specifics. Liability. For a moment, I just listened to his engine idling under his words, to the music bed running under mine, to the hum that tied both of us to the same overheated grid. He wasn't listening for my voice. He was listening for the building. I realized I was too... "Okay," I said carefully. "If you head that way, you do it slow. You don't block any emergency vehicles. You don't go climbing fences or touching anything electrical. You stay where staff tell you to stay." "Understood," he agreed, quick and eager. I gave him nothing that sounded like coordinates, just the kind of obvious instructions you could defend in a meeting later. Watch for posted signs. Do what first responders say. Don't get in the way. The rest I left between him, the hedge, and the building that couldn't breathe. When I dropped his line, I brought Maya up in my headphones. "Okay," I told her, "stay where you can see as many doors as you can. Watch the faces. If anybody's breathing changes, you say my name first." "I'm here." I eased her volume to the edge of the mix. Not off, just low so her hallway stayed threaded under everything. Her short updates, my voice, and the transmitter hum braided together, 3 systems trying not to fail on the same night. The The clock over the glass slid past another minute I hadn't planned to own. Somewhere out on the ridge, a truck with a saw and a cooler of ice sat idling near a wall that, if we were lucky, was finally going to have a little room to breathe. I opened my mic to the city. "If you're out near the ridge tonight," I said, keeping each word slow and steady, "I want you to look up. Don't go charging into anything. Don't block the drive. Don't try to play hero. Just look." I asked them to notice how many windows at Hillcrest still held light, how far the dim emergency glow seemed to reach, whether the building looked like a normal night shift or something bracing against the heat. "If it feels wrong," I added, "you call it in. You stay on the line with emergency services. You let them know you're right there. You don't disappear." The show didn't sound like my show anymore. I brought the music down until it was almost gone. The transmitter's low grumble sat under my words like a held breath, pressing in one direction. In my head, it was all leaning toward the hill. On Maya's line, one concentrator in the background gave 2 clean beeps in a row. "No grind, no catch. The nurse says the air in 12 feels a little lighter," she whispered. "Just a little." I let that hang there. The smallest good note of the night. Then, somewhere farther down her hall, another alarm started up. Caller 2 on my board stayed dark. Caller 1 burned green. I sat in the heat with my hand on the fader and understood that whatever started moving on that ridge now was tied to every word I had left. Maya's voice came back thinned out, as if the heat had burned pieces off it. Behind her, machines shrieked in competing pitches. Underneath the chorus, the generator coughed and dragged for breath like a smoker on a bad day. She said the South Hall had gone black, that only a few emergency fixtures still glowed, and those were dim, that the air in the rooms at the end felt like someone had poured warm syrup into them. The worst patients were lying under a net of plastic tubes and plastic alarms, each breath late, every machine insisting it was the only crisis in the building. The static on the line rose until I could barely separate her words from the noise. I kept her up as long as I could stand it, then promised I'd be right back, slipped her onto hold without actually dropping the call, and threw a long instrumental track at the board to cover the gap. The hall to the lounge was only a few steps, but the carpet dragged at my shoes. Inside, the lamp by my father's chair drew a hard circle of light around the blue folder and the legal pad on his knees. Arthur's pad was crowded with rectangles and lines. One thick stroke ran down the side. Thinner lines branched out from it like ribs. "This is the feed from the generator," he said. "The trunk." His nail traced the branches. Wings, laundry, kitchen, offices. Everything in the place that hummed when the power was on. "I told them to split the circuits," he said. "Give each wing its own tree, so if one went bad, the others could stay up. Safer on paper, costs more on paper. One big tree feeding everything, that's what they bought." The lines shook under his hand. "Now the whole place hangs off this one tired trunk," he said. "If somebody at that panel starts guessing, you can drop the whole thing or kill the wrong rooms." We both looked at the sketch until the paper blurred. Back in the booth, the track I'd thrown on was still rolling. I slipped my headphones on and brought Maya back. Her hallway sounded worse, alarms stepping on each other, voices thin with panic, the generator's rhythm more stumble than pulse. Somewhere behind her, someone said, "We can't keep waiting," and the words came out like they'd already been arguing about it for a while. When her line broke again, another voice came through, older and tight with effort. "We're not supposed to touch electrical," they said. "We're supposed to wait. There's a panel at the bottom of those stairs." I said, "If you don't see exactly what I'm about to describe, you walk away. You understand me. You walk away," a breath. Then a small yes. Shoes on concrete. The low rumble of the generator through the walls. Closer now. In my head, I saw the panel the way Arthur had drawn it. Gray metal door, rows of handles, crooked label tape with letters rubbed half off by years of fingers. "I have a former electrician with me," I said. "He worked that hill when they put the place in. He says you're looking for the handle labeled something like North Generator Aux." Those words, If it doesn't say that, you do not touch it." They repeated the label back to me, quiet and steady, as if saying it out loud might make it more real. I told them to put one finger on that switch and nothing else, to keep their other hand behind their back, to stand on dry floor, to pull only when they were sure, and that nothing about this felt right on my side of the glass either. Fabric brushed the phone. The alarms on their end drilled a constant high note. Somewhere above the basement, the generator coughed again, each stroke sounding more desperate. There was a small settling sound at their end, like a hand closing. For a second the line bent. Some alarms cut off mid-scream. Others shifted down into lower, less frantic tones. The generator's sputter lost one harsh note and found a rougher, more even grind. The levels on my board jumped and then steadied, as if the studio itself had exhaled with the building. I didn't know whether we had bought more than minutes or how many names we'd just moved off the edge and how many were still standing on it. I only knew that somewhere inside the big tree my father had drawn, somebody had trimmed a single branch. And my voice had told them where to cut. The breaker thud was still in my ears when the Blackwall phone rang. For a second I thought it was echo. Then the bell on the wall unit went again, sharp and metallic, like it wanted an answer. I picked up, "You told them to touch the breaker." "Are you insane?" The producer's voice came in with hard edges. Underneath it, I heard Master Control's low hum and a clock I didn't need to see. I didn't tell them to rewire anything. I said, "We walk them through one labeled switch." "One switch," he said. "If that building burns down, it's your voice on the tape, Eli. Not the manager's. Not the kids'. Yours. They'll pull the logs. And I need to be able to say I warned you." Warned lodged in my throat. Liability flashed behind it, a word hanging over some future room where my show would play back cold. "We're one lawsuit away from going dark," he went on, anger flattening into something legal. "Insurance is a joke. You start directing people around a failing electrical system on air, I don't have a station to bring you back to. Do you understand?" Through the glass, the console glowed. At the far edge, Maya's hold light burned steady green. Everything else blurred out. "I hear you," I said. What I meant was, I also heard medical alarms and a man's breath stuttering in a hallway that smelled like soup. "You keep it general," he said. "Hydrate, stay clear, wait for official instructions. If anybody asks tomorrow what I told you, that's the sentence I want to give." He was building himself a line to stand on when the tapes came out. "I couldn't live there with him. I'm not going to tell anyone to force their way inside or touch anything electrical," I said. "You can put that on your tape." Silence stretched just long enough for sweat to crawl down my spine. "Fine," he said. "Just remember, when this is over, the only thing we still own is what's on those recordings." He hung up. The dial tone buzzed in my ear like a trapped fly. I set the receiver back and slid into the booth. Maya's light stayed solid. Beside it, another line blinked. I brought the fader up. A woman's voice came through with night air wrapped around it. "There's a line of cars at the bottom of the Hillcrest road," she said. "From here, it looks like a river of headlights flowing up the hill." Behind her, horns called and answered each other. Doors thudded. Someone shouted for water. Engines idled. Somewhere close to her phone, a cooler lid snapped open and shut. "Some of us are staff they sent home," she said. "Some are family. Some just heard you and couldn't sit in their apartments while people cooked in there. We're sharing water, chargers, little fans. Nobody's really in charge, but we're trying." I saw it as she spoke, the access road glowing, people moving between bumpers with jugs and flashlights, the ridge finally answering the transmitter. "Don't block the ambulance route," I said. "Pull as far to the right as you can. Leave the lane closest to the building open. If staff or emergency crews tell you to move, you move." Another caller came in, a man with road noise close to the mic. "We're forming 2 rows now," he said. "Trucks outside, smaller cars inside. If you tell us which lane to keep clear, we'll keep it clear." He thought I was leading them. Listening to the horns and voices behind him, I realized I wasn't. The hill had already made up its mind. I was just the wire between their headlights and the building's dark windows. When the track I'd buried under the calls faded, I pulled my headphones half off and looked toward the lounge. Arthur wasn't watching the TV anymore. He was staring at his hands, palms up, as if they belonged to someone else. "Did it work?" he asked when I stepped in. His eyes stayed on his fingers. "There's a convoy at the base of the hill," I said. "Cars and trucks, people with coolers and fans. They cleared the intake. They're trying to keep the place breathing." He let out a long, uneven breath. "Good," he said. "That's one debt paid." No smile. Just a small nod, like a box ticked on a list he knew would never end. "It doesn't fix what we built wrong," he added. "You don't fix a bad tree in one night. But at least somebody's listening to the roots now." Back in the booth, the heat folded over me. The red-on-air light glared. The collar, LEDs, blinked like a nervous skyline. I opened the mic. "If you're on the hill near Hillcrest," I said, "listen up. I'm not going to tell anyone to force their way inside or touch anything electrical. That's not our job. What you can do is keep that road open and keep each other standing." I watched the lights as I spoke. Each one now a car, a lane, a person instead of a number. "Park on the right-hand side. Nose in if you can," I said. "Leave the lane closest to the building clear. Don't block driveways. Don't box the entrance. If you've got water, share it. If you've got battery fans, pass them forward. Check on the people in the car next to you. When staff come out and give directions, you follow them. You're there to support, not to take over." Callers chimed in on quick bursts, moving cars, making space, handing bottles through open windows. I let a few through, proof that the ridge was moving, not just my imagination. On any other night, I would have been the one trying to create motion, nudging lonely truckers and insomniacs toward sleep with songs and soft patter. Now the city was already in motion. I was just the thin, sweating voice in the middle, directing traffic for a river of headlights climbing a hill I still couldn't see. Sirens reached me before headlines ever would. At first they threaded faintly under the music bed, a thin rise and fall somewhere in the city. Then a caller's phone caught them too. Through the wall they were muffled, through the line they were sharp, two slightly out of sync versions of the same alarm. People on the line stopped talking just to listen. On the board, the Hillcrest channels held steady green, small fixed points in the heat. Somewhere above the stalled river of cars, engines climbed. I put a bottom of the hill caller through. Wind, gravel, and a man's hard breathing washed into my headphones. Horns chirped and answered each other behind him, annoyed and then almost coordinated. "We're stuck at the mailboxes," he said. "You can see the glow coming up through the trees." I saw it the way he did, the narrow access road, shoulders crumbling. A frozen river of headlights jammed bumper to bumper. For the first time it felt like we had built a dam instead of a path. The Blackwall phone rang again. I dropped the music and grabbed the receiver. "This is Vance," I said. On the other end, radio chatter, crackled, codes, addresses, somebody's breath in a different kind of hurry. The man who spoke sounded like he was walking uphill with a radio on his shoulder. "This is the duty officer heading Hillcrest," he said. "Tell your people to move right." "We need the lane," my throat tightened. He went on just long enough to say no one could nose into the driveway, that crews would take command at the entrance, that he needed to be able to say he had warned me if tapes got pulled. Our little station, one lawsuit away from dark, had just been hitched to his convoy. I thought about liability again. About hearing rooms, my voice played without the heat attached. "Copy," I said. "We'll clear you a lane." When I hung up, the wall seemed closer. On the board, Maya's green light still burned, my one steady star. I opened her line long enough to hear her say my name, then left her holding. First, we had to move metal. I brought the mic up. "If you're on the road up to Hillcrest," I said, "this part is for you. Emergency crews are coming up behind you. You need to move right." Do not block the mouth of the drive. Leave the middle open. If you're near the entrance, pull into the first safe spot and stay in your car until a crew tells you otherwise. Engines revved over the lines. Brakes sighed. Doors slammed as people climbed back in and shifted position. I broke the instructions into short, repeatable pieces and sent them again, the way you talk to someone who is scared and staring down a one-lane night. Outside, I still couldn't see the hill, but I could feel it reassembling. In my head, the river of headlights up the hill parted to let them through. Heavy diesel engines pushed into the space the listeners carved, growling up the grade. The same caller came back. "We're sliding over," he said. "Everybody's doing it. It looks like a parade peeling to the shoulders." I handed that picture back to the city, trimmed and clear. Not chaos, just people making room. When I brought Maya up again, the Sirens had entered her building. They bounced down painted shut halls and off the tiles. "They're here," she said. "They've got oxygen and fans and they're calling names." Behind her, high medical tones cut through the old hum. For the first time all night, the alarm sounded like steps in a plan instead of random screaming. "Stay where you can hear them," I told her. "Say my name if you need the line." The board became a switchyard. Duty officer, ridge, hallway, songs riding low so the transmitter never sat on bare fear. I realized I was not really leading anymore. The ridge had decided to move. I was directing traffic, passing signals between people who had already chosen to act. Between calls, I glanced back at the lounge. My father had left the couch. He stood at the glass with his hand flat against it, jaw tight, eyes shining. Even through two panes, I could see the tremor in his shoulders. "Did you hear them?" "They're inside," I mouthed during a short instrumental. He nodded once. His hand stayed on the glass. "Good," he said. "That's one debt paid." Then he went back to his chair, leaving a faint print on the window. The night didn't finish with a clean line. It thinned. The sirens faded into the city's general noise. Calls from the hill shifted from panic to logistics. Who was being moved first? Which cars had room for wheelchairs and tanks? Who needed rides down once the worst heat had passed? The duty officer checked in one last time, his voice rough with used-up adrenaline. He told me I could stand down on traffic, that they had crews at the road now, that whatever window they'd had, they had caught most of it, and that without the people listening to this frequency, the ridge would look very different. After he hung up, the studio felt small and overlit. Dawn seeped into the city as a gray film that made everything look tired. The heat hadn't broken, just shifted into the way people stood and walked. I watched the red-on-air eye and thought about how much of the night was already trapped on drives and backup servers tagged with my initials. Somewhere there was a file that held nothing but my voice telling strangers where to park, when to wait, when to move aside. Before I signed off, I told the city what we had done, that a building built to the minimums had leaned hard on its neighbors, that a quiet late-night show had turned, for a few hours, into a narrow channel between a bad design and good people, and that someday, when they argued about budgets and backups and what safety should cost, this would be the tape they pulled. The night they played back. Then I let one last small pause sit on the line, more breath than silence, and sent a final song toward the hill, into a sky that was finally beginning to pale at the edges. By the time I stepped out of the station, the sky had gone from black to a hard white glare, like someone had turned the contrast up and forgotten the color. The air in the lot hit my face like the breath of a dryer. Heat rolled up from the asphalt, carrying old oil and hot plastic. I slid into the car and turned the key. The engine settled into a tired idle, and the dash lit with the usual morning show. Two voices laughing about another scorcher and fried egg sidewalks. They played a jingle about staying hydrated. Every time the sounder hit, I braced for them to roll a clip from my shift. Maya's call. The sirens. They didn't. The night had already been folded into a smaller file and pushed off their rundown. The drive home passed in bleached-out pieces. The road shimmered. Traffic moved slow and sticky, like everyone was waiting instead of driving. My eyes kept wanting to close at red lights. The only thing keeping them open was the mismatch between the light chatter on the radio and the weight in my chest. My apartment smelled like warm dust and old coffee. Dad sat in his chair by the window, oxygen tube under his nose, the TV throwing a pale rectangle onto his face. Along the bottom of the screen, a red ticker crawled, Hillcrest Incident Update. The anchor's voice had that practiced, gentle edge I recognized from storm seasons and school board scandals. She gave the numbers first, like they were writing them on a whiteboard where nobody had to see the faces. 46 residents transported overnight, she said. 30 in stable condition, 8 in intensive care, 8 confirmed dead as of this morning. Names are being withheld pending notification of family, no names. Just ages and floors. When she said, 1 female resident from the second floor east wing, something in my head supplied Mistress Alvarez before I could stop it. I heard again the way Maya had said he's gray about the man in 12. The TV didn't know those voices. It just parked the numbers in a corner of the screen. Daylight made Hillcrest look even more tired. In the footage they ran, paint peeled in slow curls and the windows were just dark rectangles, some still covered from the night. Portable fans sat on the lawn, plugged into a tangle of cords. People in scrubs poured water into paper cups and shaded older bodies with whatever they could find, clipboards, jackets, the edges of blankets. Then, the shot cut to a press conference. Blue backdrop, city seal, 3 officials lined up behind microphones, collars still neat in the heat. They talked about unprecedented temperatures, a confluence of factors, our community's resilience. When a reporter asked whether backup power at Hillcrest had been up to code, the oversight guy smiled a tired, careful smile and said they were reviewing documentation and had identified areas where redundancy planning may not have reflected the current climate reality. Dad made a sound in his chair that was half cough, half bitter laugh. They knew, he said, eyes on the screen. We told them that panel would ride the edge if everything kicked on. A graphic snapped in under the anchor, timeline under review. Heat advisory issued. Facilities advised to check backup systems. Hillcrest reported all systems functional. Somewhere under that neat list sat emails with his name on them, sheets he'd stamped years ago, the lines of the one big tree they'd bought instead of the forest it should have been. My phone lit up on the counter with a bright little ping. Unknown local number. I picked it up. The woman on the other end introduced herself from Risk and Emergency Management. Her tone tried to split the difference between grateful and official. She thanked me for maintaining calm on air during an evolving situation, then she shifted into the part she'd rehearsed. As of this morning, she said, your broadcast from last night is under legal hold for the city's review. That means no edits, no deletions, no changes to any recordings, call logs, or related materials. Legal hold. Hearing the words out loud was different from reading them in memos. It meant my voice had been moved from the world of late-night noise into the world of evidence. Every breath on the line, every time I said stay with me, every instruction that sent someone up or down that hill now lived in a folder with a case number and a list of people allowed to touch it. When I hung up, Dad didn't look surprised. They're going to dig, he said quietly. They'll chase every line back to the panel, back through the contracts, back to the guy who signed off on good enough. They'll see where we shave copper to make the numbers work. He finally turned from the TV and really looked at me. His eyes were red in a way the oxygen tube couldn't explain. They'll find my stamp, he said, and they'll find your voice. Another alert blinked on my screen, voicemails from the station's listener line, forwarded automatically. I hit play and set the phone down between us. Distorted, emotional voices filled the room in short bursts. The first message came from a woman who called herself Nora. Her voice shook, but there was a steadiness under it. My mom was on that second floor, she said. A nurse told me there were people outside with fans and water before the trucks even got there. She said they heard it on the radio. I don't know who you are, but thank you. I feel like the whole hill was less alone because somebody kept talking. The second message had no greeting, just a hard inhale and a man's voice pushed tight around the words, "I don't understand how a city lets an old folks' home cook like that," he said. "I don't know if your show helped or made it worse. I heard people saying they drove up there because of you. My uncle didn't come back. A nurse told me in the hallway like she was reading a list. So you make sure those tapes stay put when lawyers start asking who knew what and when. I want to hear every second." The recording clicked off. The room settled into the sound of the box fan in the corner, rattling as it pushed hot air in a slow loop. The TV went back to traffic updates and school openings. Hillcrest shrank back down to a crawl along the bottom. Dad's oxygen hissed softly. "You did more than they ever planned for," he said. "They built to the minimums and hoped the night would never test them. You gave that building something it was never promised. I also kept people up on that hill," I said. "Some of them lost someone anyway." He nodded once, like that was the only honest place to leave it. On the news, the anchor moved on to the next story. The graphic with the casualty count faded out, replaced by a smiling meteorologist pointing at a map that still glowed red. In my head, the show replayed as jagged cuts. Maya's first call, the generator's cough under her words, the duty officer's radio in my ear, the truck driver saying he could feel hot air on his face, the river of headlights parting. Somewhere, under legal hold, it existed as clean digital tracks with time codes and indexes and my name in the metadata. For them, it would be evidence. For me, it was still a night full of breaths in the dark. Some of them stopping, some of them starting again. I scrolled past texts from colleagues, a link to a think piece calling us the little station that rallied a hill, another about hard questions for aging infrastructure. The heat pressed in from the glass, from the floor, from the screens. The city had put my tape in a vault and locked it for later. They had turned the show into part of the record. What I hadn't decided yet was how much of my own voice I was willing to add to all the other voices that would be called to explain why Hillcrest sounded the way it did. On the hottest night the city had ever had, and the morning that tried to pretend it was just another day. The email from the city landed in my inbox just after lunch, when the apartment was dim and the air felt only barely cooler than the sidewalk. Subject line: Hillcrest Incident. Request for statement. They thanked me for my role in community communication during the emergency and invited me, as the host of the late-night program in question, to submit a written account for the review panel. At the bottom, in bold, a countdown. Deadline for submission, 24 hours. 5 minutes later, the station's message arrived, stacked right under it. Legal had forwarded the same request with a file named station_response_template. I opened it and read the phrases they wanted my name under. According to that draft, my show had provided general information on heat and safety, had encouraged residents to follow official guidance, had received calls from community members expressing concern, no time codes, no Maya, no ridge, no river of headlights, no Arthur breathing in the next room. It sounded like any other warm night. I sat at the small table by the window, laptop open, fan on the floor pushing warm air in slow circles. Outside, the afternoon shimmered on parked cars. Inside, the template waited in one tab, a blank document in another. My cursor blinked between two versions of the same night, the one that made me harmless and the one I would have to live with. If I signed their version, I would stay the guy with the late-night voice, the calm presence who never quite said enough to be blamed. If I wrote mine, I would be the man who had answered a call from a building that was already halfway into the news and decided to step over a line anyway. I clicked into the blank document. At first, the typing sounded hesitant, small bursts of keys. The words came out stiff: time, date, call log. I wrote that at 1:12 a.m., a volunteer from Hillcrest reported a full power loss and a backup she believed had less than 3 hours of fuel, that the windows on her hallway would not open, that at least one resident was already going gray in the heat. I wrote that when I tried to route her back through official channels, I heard nothing but hold music and polite recordings. Behind me, Arthur's oxygen machine filled the quiet with its soft mechanical pulse. His chair creaked. "You writing it?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "For the panel, he let that hang for a beat." Daytime TV murmured nonsense from the other room. "They already sent you the safe one," he said. "They want you to sign the version where you were just wallpaper." I turned so I could see him. The light caught the lines at the corners of his eyes, the years of fluorescent ceilings and job site dust. "I signed the safe version 20 years ago," he went on, "back when we were arguing about that panel. I signed the one that said we met the code and everything else would probably be fine. Look where it got us." He lifted a hand, as if to brush away the press conference phrases we'd heard all morning. "Unprecedented heat, confluence of factors within parameters they're going to write their speech either way," he said. "What you get to choose is whether your part sounds like you, or like something they sanded down. Don't let them edit you. Let it be your voice." Then he turned back to the TV. For him, the conversation was finished. For me, it landed right where the cursor blinked. I closed the template and dragged my cursor back to my own rough paragraphs. I kept writing. I wrote that I invited listeners near Hillcrest to stay awake, to drive out, to bring cars with working air, fans, cold water. I wrote that my father, a retired electrician who had worked on Hillcrest, was in the next room describing, live and unplanned, how the building was wired like one big tree, and that I used that knowledge when I chose what to say. I wrote that legal had warned me about liability and incitement, that the city resource line told me not to direct anyone near equipment, and that I understood my words might pull people toward danger as well as away from it. I wrote that I crossed that line anyway, because the alternative was pretending I didn't hear a building calling for help. The more I typed, the less it felt like filling in a form, and the more it felt like talking into the mic on a bad night, when I forgot to protect myself and just told the truth. I admitted that I did not know how many lives the show helped or how many minutes it cost, and that I was prepared to have both counted. When I reached the end, I read it through once, quietly, the way I would read a monologue in my head before I hit the ON air light. It didn't sound brave. It sounded tired and exact and mine. I pasted the text into the city's form, in the field where the template expected its safer cousin. The page wrapped my words in gray boxes and small font warnings. In the corner, the button waited. For a moment, my hand hovered over the trackpad. The fan hummed at my ankles. Arthur's machine sighed behind me. I thought about the people who would eventually read this: lawyers, aides, reporters, maybe some kid years from now pulling a quote for a story about the night the hill lit up. I imagined them hearing either the station's language or mine, and tried to decide which one I could live with. I pictured Maya's green light on the board and the river of headlights moving because of something I had said. I pictured the blank space on a future timeline where my part could sit either as general information or as the messy record of what actually happened. Then I clicked. The screen jumped to a confirmation page with a case number and a polite line about my cooperation being appreciated. The document slid away into whatever system held the rest of the evidence. The apartment felt strangely quiet, even with the fan and the TV still going. For the first time since the word Hillcrest had come out of the speaker, I felt something in my chest ease. Not because I thought I was safe, but because I had finally chosen which version of my own voice I was willing to live with on the tape. The report arrived on a bright morning that felt too clean for what it held. Outside, birds were busy in the heat-stunned trees, traffic ticking along the avenue. On my phone, it was just a PDF link between a coupon blast and a note from my kid's school. 3 lines down, my name sat between community radio host and audio materials under legal hold. I waited until Dad finished his pills before I opened it. The window unit buzzed, pushing air that was mostly sound. On the couch, he watched a replay of the city's press conference, the anchor's serious voice rolling out phrases we'd already heard. I skipped the boilerplate and found the numbers. 47 residents in Hillcrest the night of the blackout. 39 evacuated. 12 still in rehab. 8 dead. I read that paragraph twice, letting the 8 stay 8. Under the tally sat a sentence that hooked under my ribs. Mortality and morbidity outcomes were measurably improved by early informal community mobilization. Informal community mobilization. Their name for the river of headlights at the base of the hill. For coolers and trunks. Strangers passing water through car doors. Engines left running. For a girl with a hissy phone line who would not hang up. For a tired man in a small room saying, "Stay with me," into a mic. Farther down, in a section on communication, they mentioned the show by name. During the event, a late-night community radio program functioned as an unofficial communication node. One more line reminded me that audio from that night remains under legal hold. On the TV, the segment shifted. A simple floor plan came up. Rectangles feeding rectangles. The anchor flattened phrases like undersized generator, historic cost-saving, legacy wiring into even syllables. I watched Dad's eyes track the lines. "They showing Hillcrest?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. They didn't put his name on the screen. They didn't show the stamp he had once pressed on the plans. The report folded his decisions into historic cost-saving measures and outdated risk assumptions. It didn't absolve him. It did something else. His shoulders dropped a notch. For the first time, his guilt had edges that were shared. Posters went up in lobbies and bus shelters, lists of cooling centers and backup checks. At the station, a laminated sheet appeared near the console, Heatwave/blackout protocol. Halfway down, in smaller type, was a line that made my throat tighten. See? Case study. Hillcrest community response, late night call-in show one Friday. My kid came to the station after school. Backpack half zipped, math workbook under one arm. Their sneakers squeaked on the floor. In the lobby, a city flyer was taped to the wall. Hillcrest Heatwave reforms. What's changing this summer? The photo showed the hill green and quiet. They stopped in front of it. "Was that your show?" they asked. "The one they mean?" "Yeah." I said that was my night. They looked at the picture for a second. "Were you scared?" they asked. A row of clean, grown-up answers lined up in my head. I let them go. I was scared the whole time. I said I just didn't want to hang up on them. They nodded, as if that fit with something they already knew, and kept walking down the hall. In the booth, they curled up on the beat-up couch, pencil tapping against the workbook. I set my printed statement, the one I had sent the city, on the shelf under the board, instead of back in the drawer. The paper had a small coffee stain. It looked handled, not wholly. Outside the glass, the city moved through another hot evening. Hillcrest had a new generator now, one that took up more space in the diagrams. Somewhere on a server, the recording of our worst hours sat, tagged, and stored, waiting for whoever needed to hear what it sounded like when a hill asked for help. I slipped on my headphones. The studio had finally gotten its AC serviced. The air from the vent still felt warm, but it no longer smelled like dust burning. When I eased the fader up, the familiar bed of room tone rose around me, the faint buzz of the tower, the soft breath of the room, a shoe scuff from the couch where my kid was trying to sit still. The red light over the glass blinked, then held. My kid shifted, trying not to make noise, but their shoe brushed the fabric anyway. I rested my hand on the mic, feeling the tiny vibration in the metal, the pulse of the transmitter somewhere out on its tower. This used to be background noise, company for night drivers and insomniacs. After Hillcrest, it felt like a wire someone might grab when the official lines went quiet. "Good evening," I said. "It's still warm out there. If you're awake, I'm here. If you're stuck somewhere and it feels like nobody sees you, call me. We'll stay on the line." It wasn't a promise that nothing bad would happen again. It was something smaller and harder to break, that as long as the light was red and the hum was there, I would pick